Well, really glad to be here. Thanks for being here. Rob, looking forward to the conversation. My name's Christoffer Holmgard. I'm one of the people who started Modl.ai, where we combine game tech and AI for game production pipelines with a focus on QA. I've been doing video games since 2008 and AI for video games since 2011. And since 2018, that's what we've been doing at Modl.ai, headquartered here in Copenhagen, Denmark, where I'm calling in from.
I'm just absolutely chuffed to be here. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Rob Sandberg. I've been making video games for about the last 30 years across all platforms. Of the last 15 years, I've been focused in mobile, and probably for the last decade, specifically in live operations. I currently am a consultant who provides support to teams who want to improve their workflows and think in probabilistic ways of working.
Very exciting. Glad to meet you, Rob. Yeah, so just kicking us off here and kind of like getting into the conversation. I know that you call yourself a production alchemist, which I mean, it's an awesome title. And it's also one where I might just ask, what's that actually mean? Or what do you do in the context of game development? And
Sure.
obviously, yeah.
When we think of alchemists, these were the folks, back in the dark ages who thought that they could convert, lead into gold. I think in a more modern context, I think an alchemist is somebody who seeks to improve things through science, philosophy, or through the magic of innovation. Their aim is to uncover the potential of the mundane and turn something ordinary into something absolutely amazing. I don't think there's anything more mundane than the perception of game QA and game production. So my aim is to shed a light on it, on both of those disciplines, and provide unconventional perspectives to challenge the status quo and the norms as we know them today, and to try to push to make things better.
Sounds like that's something that still might be needed. Do you think there are still parts of the way that we do QA in production that is still in those dark ages?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I've had the great fortune of seeing like the wide spectrum, right? Like I joined a large publisher where QA was done in the way we did it back in the 90s, where it was, a waterfall process that happened at the end. But I've also been part of game studios that were on the bleeding edge, where we were using automation built into the Git flow, into the CI/CD pipelines, and getting reports every morning and understanding the stability of our master branch on a day-to-day basis. And we shifted left and improved QA workflows. So I've seen the spectrum, and I know the potential is out there.
Yeah, I understand. Over your career, you've seen it evolve like from A to B, and considering sort of like bad experience in what you just described, what would you say is the main thing that might be holding teams back from fully integrating it into development?
I hate to say this, a lot of it comes down to cost. The thing that I've seen a tremendous shift to moving to outsourced QA, which, to be honest with you, I don't have a problem with outsourced QA. I think it's a great idea because if we do have to be cost conscious, but unfortunately it's thought of as almost as an afterthought. And, I believe that you risk losing the connective tissue between the game developers and the QA testers, where it becomes a culture of JIRA tickets and sometimes adversity, where you create these adverse environments where people are not communicating as clearly as they could. You can't just pick up the phone or walk down the hall to somebody who is offshore. And the other problem that you have is that there's turnover in those vendors, right? It's creating a culture where people can stay with the team and they stay with the product, and you can capitalize on their greater understanding. A lot of times, there are a lot of times they're work for hire contract. You don't really have control over who's on the other end of the line. They have service level agreements that they have to maintain, but those create huge challenges.
Understood. Yeah, it must be harder to keep sort of like that, connectedness and trust between teams and functions when people are a little further away. It's just humanity.
Now, I've seen it work. Like, I just got a happy birthday greeting from a QA lead who happens to work for a third party who I met with every morning for, probably 18 months. I had, my morning coffee with this person. And so there are bright lights. There are organizations that, by using key person agreements and by making sure that their people are getting compensated at the rate that they should, Those type, there are ways to work around it, but it takes a greater understanding and it takes a bit of empathy and understanding from the senior leadership.
Of course. Well, then, I mean, from there, and maybe shifting gears a little bit, you mentioned when we started, you've worked extensively in live ops, and that obviously, that's a certain category of industry with certain needs. So for that specific category, given your experience, what are the biggest challenges there for live service games? How does automation fit it?
I'm going to talk about in the context of mobile games. Most mobile games that move from being scrappy startups to enterprise are really, it's like lightning in a bottle. They've caught lightning in a bottle. A lot of times these teams weren't prepared for that type of growth. There wasn't, any appreciation for scalability when they were making these early prototypes that just happened to hit. And, I believe that it's that the mindset where you shift from being a scrappy game developer to an enterprise scale game service, where if making that transition, but still kind of keeping the magic of what it means to be a game studio. And when I say the magic of game studio, I'm not talking about, beanbag chairs and ping pong tables, because those are the types of hygiene factors that, live service, see in every studio. It's like a rubber stamp, right? It's more the idea of keeping the ability to be live, think agile, being able to, do your best to tear down the silos as they build, to be able to have, the ability to turn on a dime, because you have that when you're a small scrappy studio, but as soon as you grow to scale, you lose that flexibility. So I believe, the mindset of agility that you had as a scrappy startup, I think needs to be able to be realized in an enterprise scale.
And so like keeping that stance or keeping that mindset and agility, do you see how does technology and automation fit into that? Have you seen good examples of people applying that to stay smaller or at least stay more agile?
Oh yeah, most definitely. I want to call out one of my past teams, Product Madness. They make 3 top grossing social casino games, and it's a big beast. It takes almost 600 people to produce those 3 games. That game is a monster. And they, I believe, are some of the leaders in the industry when it comes to automated testing, the use of AI as part of that automated testing, and the ongoing commitment to automated testing with the appropriate expenditures towards, the engineers, the automation engineers that can set up those stories. When I left, the studio, it was about 45% of use cases were covered by automation. Especially if you've got a game that's not changing, or you've got a game where you've got the content that keeps coming back. It's very easy to do. But what they've been able to gain from that is being able to cut a release candidate, right, after the merge, when they've merged into this, very complex pipeline. It used to take 3 or 4 weeks to be able to get a game out the door. The use of automation, along with shifting left, they took from almost a month down to 2 or 3 days to be able to get from cutting a release to submission to the App Store. And so, I believe they are, and I just had a conversation with one of the producers last night over a pint of beer, and he was just talking about, a renewed commitment to that and improving it and making it better, so that the resources necessary to do the automation need to be part of the main line scope.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you kind of have to commit to a little more cost up front, or at least another cost category. But it also sounds like that might have enabled them to take more, I don't know, maybe even more creative chances, or kind of at least to explore more options as a consequence.
What it does is it helps you realize your value sooner, right? It takes, develop a feature for a top grossing game. You could spend, 3, 6, 9 months to develop a feature. And if you can cut 25% of that time off and be able to deliver that feature, because features equal revenue, right?
Yep.
You can realize your value sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that also speaks to kind of how QA can enhance creativity, like automation and QA can help, see broader perspectives for the game.
I think we forget sometimes that QA is part of the creative process, right? Mm-hmm. First of all, the definition of QA isn't finding bugs, it's preventing bugs, right? And so, The earlier that you can have QA as part of your process, part of your creative process, whether that be GDD reviews, whether that be part of the pitching process, whether that be, early playtesting of prototypes. There's nobody closer to the player than a tester, a field level tester. There's nobody that understands or has empathy for the player more because they've played that game 1,000 times. And then a lot of times you'll have people that work, especially in live operations, you'll have people that don't really touch the game, right? They don't really play the game and they're making decisions, right? And so allowing them to have a seat at the table, I think, is integral especially if you're looking to do any type of innovation.
Yeah, it's almost like it's communication across the organization around like where's the game at now and like what would the player experience, as you're saying, in addition to all the other stuff that you have to do, of course.
Well, it's easy to get lost behind all of the boring, dull reports and all, the burn down charts and all of those types of things, all of the artifacts that you would have, with QA, the test case development, right? But that what do they call that? That blank moment that you're looking for, like Malcolm Gladwell talks about that a lot, right? Where they could tell just something doesn't feel right. And you're not going to get that from a product manager who's really excited about a feature. You're only going to get that from somebody who's put the time into playing the game.
I mean, talking about all the things and all the like concrete work that goes into QA and the fact that, it sounds like there are steps at all parts of the process points at all parts of the process where QA is super valuable. The other side of it is maybe that often, great demands will be made of QA teams as well. So, burnout is an issue in game development. Crunch happens still. Given what we just talked about, it hits QA as well. So do you have thoughts on what that should look like in the future? Like another side, like when people want that value and are asking for a lot of it, what could we do to make that sustainable?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to accept that crunch is a failing leadership. Full stop. There's no other way around it. I've made very career limiting statements many times over the years about the fact that I don't support it. I never have. I never will. It doesn't work. I've worked in cultures of crunch in the 90s. It was almost seen as a badge of courage to, sleep under your desk or have a bedroll or what have you. And if you didn't, you weren't part of the team. People like myself who had young families who, I would need to go home and make dinner. It's like I'd have to make dinner for my kids, right? And I was seen as being, not part of the team, or it's being unfair because other people are having to work longer. So, when we talk about like the production alchemy and the unconventional points of view, doing everything I can to prevent crunch and to be able to communicate from top down to bottom up that it's not necessary, it's not a badge of courage, it shouldn't be rewarded in terms of promotion, and because it's an easy cop out. I believe that it's improved, but it took lawsuits, the EA spouse and, unionization, threat of unionization and all those things. I think the leading culprit is optimism bias and overconfidence from senior leadership. I think sometimes it's due to survival. I think, especially for third-party developers, they will take on a project because it's based on what the payer will pay. And, and a lot of times, the success and failure of a project is determined right at the signing of the development agreement. And unfortunately, it's, we have to pay the price for it. I think it's worse in like feature animation and things like that than it is in games. I think it's getting better in games. But I think we as leaders need to be better at the way that we make our commitments to our stakeholders who are funding these endeavors. I'm a big believer of probabilistic thinking, of using things like Monte Carlo simulations to be able to answer the question of when things will be done by using actual team data. And by doing that, you take out all the bias. You leverage the power of probabilistic thinking and random sampling. And then what you do is then you come to the situation with a risk in mind. Instead of me saying, Christoffer, I'm going to have this game done for you on August 1st.
Right. Yeah.
I'm set with that. The thing I know about game executives is they won't remember your name of your game. They won't remember your name, but they will never forget a date you've ever presented. So instead of doing that, I would say, well, we've run the numbers and there's a 50% chance that we can get it to you on August 1st. There's an 85% chance that we can do it on September 1st. So now I'm coming to you not only with the range of possibilities, I've also built in probabilistic risk management, right? So then it's like, hey, in the multiverse, 50% of the time we got it right, but 50% of the time we didn't, right? And so by coming at it with that probabilistic thinking, right, it gives you the opportunity and the strength to be able to arm yourself with a shield and a spear and fight in the boardroom for the time necessary to be able to get things done. And now you've got the data to back it up.
And ultimately, I guess that builds trust as well, right? Because you're actually representing like potential realities at a much more, granular and realistic level.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And in my eyes, you need to be thinking about your overall life cycles from concept to cash, right? And that's the only way that you can get the bigger pictures. A lot of times, so much time is spent on the design ideation process that by the time those folks are done, it's a crunch on the developers to get things done. And it's unfair because, they're the end of the chain sometimes. And so by keeping an eye on the pre-production ideation process, on their cycle times, on their time boxes, and respecting their handovers, by having a more global picture of your value chain, I believe that you can better represent exactly when things will be done.
Yeah, and I imagine you're also losing out on things that could have improved the product if there's no time to implement that, like at the end of the chain.
Oh, also the other way around. Sometimes you have gas left in the tank, right? Why not take advantage, get another iteration, get another feature
Totally.
in, right? Because it works both ways.
Makes complete sense.
Yeah.
Well, circling back again to kind of like, crunch is a failure of strategy, I suppose. If you were setting up a brand new studio and thinking specifically about QA strategy to find the right one there, if you were talking to a group of like one of these scrappy, about to be maybe one day lightning in the bottle development teams, what advice would you give to them to say, like, this will set you up for success from the first day?
I think having a culture of quality in your mission statement and living and breathing that. And what I mean by a culture of quality is where everyone in the studio is accountable for quality. Now, they may not be accountable for testing the game, and validating these tests and going through test plans and going through, use cases and such, but learning to think like a developer and understanding, the value of understanding exactly what a feature is, from the very core of it, from acceptance, right? So everybody in product management should understand what the acceptance criteria is. If anything, they're the ones who should be learning to write acceptance criteria. So then the QA can then take that acceptance criteria from a product perspective, and then they can focus less on that and focus more on the product. I mean, talk about shifting left from day one. Making sure that your development budgets, right, include somebody in QA to pair up with a programmer. It doesn't have to be one-to-one, right? But having, one QA for every 3 to 5 developers, that's a very realistic number that doesn't have that much of an impact to the overall product, but it'll completely pay out in spades. Because if you teams that put off QA till the end have all the problems with context switching. Now I'm fixing a bug for a piece of code that I wrote 3 weeks ago, or a month ago, or 5 weeks ago. Instead of doing that, it's a lot easier if you can be correcting those deficits in situ while it's still fresh in your mind. And a lot of times, if you've got somebody on your team, they're going to know the game, they're going to know the functional specifications better than the developers. And so why not sign those things off earlier before they get into the hands of your stakeholders, your product managers, your game designers, the ones who are actually, validating these things.
Yeah, makes total sense. And also, that context switching that you're talking about is super expensive, right? But hard to prove inside one game project, but you could definitely show it between multiple, I suppose.
Well, most definitely. So like, I was one of those clipboard carrying producers that walked around and said, "Hey, what are you doing today? Hey, do you got a minute? Hey, can you ask me?" And I think one of the things that I love about asynchronous communication over things like Slack and remote work is that now we can give our developers some heads downtime, right? They can just turn off their notifications. They can just sit there and mow through these problems. One of the things that I've seen, especially with AI, everybody has got this idea that AI is going to revolutionize coding because you can do all of this coding all automatically in copilots and such. But the reality is the best game developers are only writing one tiny little line of code to create the types of improvement and optimizations you're looking for. And that only comes from the time to think, the time to understand. I always say they don't fix bugs on their computer. they fix bugs while they're washing up dishes or they're in the shower. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
for sure.
That's where problems are solved.
And it's all about getting people to that moment, like eventually, and when we come back with the impact.
Yep.
Going from those kind of thoughts, like you have experience across, both AAA, mobile gaming, seen a lot of practices. But if you were to do a short list, a laundry list of like the most important practices to adopt to make sure that releases are high quality without necessarily bloating the team, what would be your top numbers there?
Yeah, boy, it's interesting. Jason Schreiber just came out with an article where he was talking about exposing, these big budgets and calling out that the excuse that you hear from a lot of studio executives of the complexity of the platforms is the big reason behind the bloating budgets. And I like to challenge that. Yes, indeed, it is a lot more sophisticated making an asset for, UE5 than it was back in the day, right? But I think that's a simple cop-out. I believe in many cases it's a byproduct of poor management.
Mm-hmm.
I've been in these meetings where these executives who either have never made a game or they made games a long time ago and they're so disconnected from the process, start playing, Jenga, with, hey, let's solve this problem by building these great towers and, blocks and pieces around, solving problems with org charts. And, to be honest with you, I think that a lot of times, when you do that, you get a couple of things. One, you get to hurry up and wait because, okay, great. We've got this team. They're there. Now what are they going to do? Because there's been no production planning for them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the other problem that you have has to do from poor onboarding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, these are very complicated widgets, the understanding of how just to get a polygon through the pipeline so that it appears in your game engine, right, is an amazing process. And if those processes are not documented, which most aren't, but if those documents aren't processed, if there's not training allocated for it, and there's not, stewardship or mentorships to help people through those processes, a lot of times you're just throwing them in the deep end, hoping that they can swim. And, again, I don't want to be too critical, my contemporaries, in the boardroom, but a lot of them have forgot how the sausage is made. And, when it cut, and also too, it's very easy to say, you know what? My son played the first level today. He really didn't like it. Let's scrap that and let's redo it. I think there's so much on the cutting room floor. That's the thing that I hear most from developers. I have friends that have worked on games for years on a game and have never gotten an asset actually into production because of the changing, winds and the creative folks who come in after the fact. Now, don't get me wrong. I do believe you need iteration. You do need to have, the discipline to cut. I completely agree with that. You have to iterate your way to fun, but I believe it's done to excess without a lot of discipline, or, they throw that rock in the pond and then they turn their backs and don't understand the ripple effect.
So it sounds like getting information up to, or rather maybe having information received by senior leadership is actually one of the key things that need to happen in most production flows.
Yeah, I think so. Again, I've made a lot of career limiting statements in the past, so I'm not afraid to say this. I believe that, unfortunately, when it comes to game production and QA, like I said, it's one of those things that's perceived as mundane. It's like a checkmark thing. We don't think about it. We've been doing this for years. We don't need to worry about this.
Mm-hmm.
But, I believe that executives need to understand that, QA needs a seat at the table. They, shouldn't be taken for granted, right? The work that they do needs to be better understood, and that they should be involved sooner in the process, and their voices need to be, amplified. And so, a lot of times, because of the nature of outsourcing, the fact that QA is a larger part of the budget, a lot of times QA executives are spreadsheet warriors, right? More than they are proponents for quality and pushing the bar. And, with, the need to get products out sooner or later, the attitude, oh, well, we can hot fix that, which is something that I hate. Again, like Crunch, I think hot fixes are a failure of management, not a failure of the team, because you're pushing something out that's not quite ready. So, having the proper checks and balances so that it's not just a product decision, that it's the triumvirate of product, production and QA who are making the decisions about, is this meeting our quality? Because, quality, unfortunately, it's your unseen KPI, right? Like, when it comes to conversion or revenue especially on free-to-play games, like, getting someone to buy or spend, you're more likely to do that if they have a perception that this game is maintained, well taken care of, and is, very, very good, right? And I think that's the advantage of having, a culture of quality can actually not only improve the products, but I believe it can add to the bottom line.
It's a latent variable that impacts like all the other KPIs that you might measure in many ways.
Yeah, most definitely.
If we want to compress that into just like one sentence or one line, like the one thing that executives and decision makers in the industry need to understand about the strategic value of QA and game development, is there any kind of like, version of that you'd want to send us out with?
Yeah. Shift left, automate, and let your QA have a seat at the table.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.